The fluorescent lights in TechFlow Industries' boardroom hummed overhead as I sat across from Bradley Thornton, the man I once believed was my trusted business partner. After 5 years of 16-hour days, countless sleepless nights debugging code, and sacrificing my personal life to build this company from nothing, I was finally requesting what I'd earned. My $300,000 performance bonus sat documented in my contract clear as daylight. Bradley leaned back in his leather chair, his smirk growing wider as he glanced at the financial reports showing our record-breaking quarterly profits. Then he laughed. Not a chuckle, but a full mocking belly laugh that echoed through the silent room. "Your $300,000 bonus is now a coffee party," he announced, sliding a check across the mahogany table. $300. The room fell dead silent. I stared at that insulting check, my hands trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. $300. After everything I had given this company, after the algorithm that revolutionized our entire industry came directly from my brain, after I had essentially built the technical foundation that made TechFlow worth millions, Bradley had reduced my contribution to coffee money. The other employees around the conference table avoided eye contact, their faces flushed with secondhand embarrassment. Sarah, our chief financial officer, studied her manicured fingernails as if they held the secrets of the universe. The development team I had mentored and trained shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly torn between loyalty to me and fear of contradicting their CEO. "This is a mistake," I managed to say, my voice steadier than I felt. "My contract clearly states performance-based compensation tied to company profits. We just posted our biggest quarter in company history." Bradley's expression shifted from amusement to cold dismissal. "Jamie, you're a valued employee, but let's not get ahead of ourselves here. You work for TechFlow Industries. You don't own it." Those words hit me like a physical blow. Employee. After everything we had built together after those early days, when it was just the two of us working out of his garage, surviving on pizza, and dreams, he was reducing me to just another employee. I gathered my dignity and stood up slowly. "I see. Well, thank you for clarifying your position, Bradley. I think I understand perfectly now." The drive home felt like a blur of California traffic and swirling thoughts. My small apartment in Palo Alto welcomed me with its familiar silence, but tonight that silence felt suffocating rather than peaceful. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my couch, staring at that $300 check like it was a piece of evidence in a crime I was just beginning to understand. Something was wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong. Bradley's casual dismissal of my contributions, the way Sarah had refused to meet my eyes, the uncomfortable silence from my team. This wasn't just about money. This was about erasure. I walked to my home office and pulled out the cardboard box of personal items I had grabbed from my desk before leaving TechFlow. Buried beneath old notebooks and printed code reviews, my fingers found something I had almost forgotten about. A manila envelope yellowed with age, stuffed behind some technical manuals. My heart began to race as I opened it. Inside were documents from TechFlow's earliest days, papers I had signed when the company was nothing more than an ambitious idea and a rented garage space. My hands shook as I pulled out a formal document with both our signatures at the bottom. Founders Agreement. The words jumped off the page like a revelation. I read through the legal language with growing amazement and fury. There, in black and white, was my signature on a document that granted me 20% equity ownership in TechFlow Industries in exchange for developing the proprietary algorithm that would become our core technology. The agreement was dated 5 years ago, just weeks after Bradley and I had shaken hands on our partnership. 20% ownership, not employee compensation, not performance bonuses, ownership. The room seemed to spin as I realized what this meant. Bradley hadn't just stolen my bonus. He had stolen my entire identity as a co-founder. According to this document, I wasn't just an employee who deserved better treatment. I was a business owner who had been systematically written out of my own company's history. I read the agreement 3 more times, checking every detail, every clause, every signature. There was no ambiguity. In exchange for working without salary for the first 18 months, while I developed our revolutionary data processing algorithm, I had been granted substantial equity in the company. The algorithm that now powered every aspect of TechFlow's business operations. The algorithm that made our recent IPO announcement possible. IPO announcement. Bradley had mentioned it casually during the meeting, as if it was just another business milestone. But if I owned 20% of the company, I owned 20% of whatever windfall that public offering would generate. We were talking about tens of millions of dollars. My phone buzzed with a text message from my neighbor asking if I was okay, because she could hear me pacing. I hadn't even realized I had been walking circles around my apartment for the past hour, clutching that agreement like a lifeline. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that it took my breath away. Bradley hadn't just decided to shortchange my bonus on a whim. He had been planning this deception for years, building an entire corporate structure designed to erase my foundational contributions to the company. But now I had proof. Legal, documented, signed proof that I was never just an employee. I was a founder who had been robbed of my own legacy. I picked up my phone and began searching for corporate attorneys in Silicon Valley. If Bradley wanted to play games with my life's work, he was about to learn that some games have consequences he never saw coming. 3 days later, I sat in the downtown San Francisco office of Diana Walsh, one of the most feared corporate litigation attorneys in California. Her corner office overlooked the Bay, and her reputation for destroying fraudulent executives was legendary among Silicon Valley insiders. She had agreed to see me immediately after I mentioned the words founder's agreement and IPO fraud in the same sentence. Diana was nothing like the slick suit-wearing lawyers I had imagined. She was a petite woman in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair and steel-gray eyes that seemed to see through every lie before it was spoken. Her office walls were covered with framed newspaper articles documenting her victories against corporate criminals. "Tell me everything," she said, settling behind her desk with a legal pad and the founder's agreement I had brought. "Start from the beginning and don't leave out any details, no matter how small they seem." I spent 2 hours walking through the history of TechFlow Industries from those early days in Bradley's garage to the moment he handed me that insulting $300 check. Diana took extensive notes, occasionally asking pointed questions about specific dates, conversations, and business decisions. "This is worse than I initially thought," Diana said after reviewing my documents. "What you're describing isn't just breach of contract or forgotten paperwork. This appears to be systematic fraud designed to steal your ownership stake." Over the next week, Diana's investigation team dove deep into TechFlow's corporate filings, and what they discovered made my blood run cold. Bradley hadn't just hidden my founder's agreement. He had actively worked to erase any evidence that I was anything more than a regular employee. "Look at this," Diana said, spreading documents across her conference table during our follow-up meeting. "These are TechFlow's official incorporation papers filed with the state of California. According to these documents, Bradley Thornton is listed as the sole founder and original shareholder. But look at the dates." She pointed to a stamp in the corner of the incorporation papers. They were dated 6 months after my founder's agreement was signed, but the papers claimed Bradley had been the sole founder from day one. "That's impossible," I said, studying the timeline. "We were already working together as partners when these papers claim he founded the company alone." "Exactly. And it gets worse." Diana pulled out another stack of papers. "These are board meeting minutes from the past 3 years. Every major decision, every equity distribution, every corporate milestone. Notice anything missing?" I scanned through the documents, seeing Bradley's signature on resolution after resolution, decision after decision. "There's no mention of me anywhere. It's like I never existed." Because in Bradley's version of corporate history, you never did exist as a founder. He's created an entirely fictional timeline where he developed your algorithm himself, incorporated the company as sole owner, and hired you as an employee 2 years later. Diana's assistant brought in another box of documents. "These are the financial records we subpoenaed from TechFlow's accounting firm." The picture gets even more disturbing. The financial documents revealed that Bradley had been licensing my algorithm to other companies for massive fees, money that should have been flowing partially to me as a 20% owner. Over the past 3 years, those licensing deals had generated over $15 million in revenue that I had never seen a penny of. "He's been actively profiting from your intellectual property while maintaining the legal fiction that you're just an employee," Diana explained. "And Sarah, your CFO, has been helping him do it." She showed me internal emails between Bradley and Sarah discussing how to clean up the founding documents and eliminate potential equity claims. The emails were dated just 6 months ago, right around the time Bradley would have begun serious IPO preparation. "They knew this day was coming," I said, feeling sick to my stomach. They've been planning to cut me out of the IPO from the beginning. Diana nodded grimly. The IPO prospectus is going to paint Bradley as the brilliant sole founder who built this company from nothing. Every investor presentation, every financial projection, every growth story is going to be built on the foundation of your stolen work. The scope of the deception was staggering. Bradley hadn't just stolen my bonus or forgotten about an old agreement. He had constructed an elaborate corporate fiction designed to rewrite history and steal millions of dollars that rightfully belonged to me. "What can we do?" I asked. Diana's smile was sharp as a blade. "We're going to let him dig his hole a little deeper, and then we're going to bury him in it. The IPO presentation is scheduled for next month, right?" That's what he announced in the meeting. Perfect. The deeper he commits to this fraud in front of investors, the more devastating the consequences will be when we expose the truth. Bradley wants to play games with your life's work. Let's show him what happens when those games have real consequences. For the first time since that humiliating meeting in the TechFlow boardroom, I felt a spark of hope. Bradley had made a critical mistake. He had underestimated the woman whose genius had built his empire, and now that empire was about to crumble around him. Just as Diana and I were planning our next moves, an unexpected phone call changed everything. It came on a Thursday evening as I was reviewing legal documents at home, preparing for what we expected to be a long battle to prove my ownership claims. "Jamie, this is Marcus Thompson. I used to work in the development department at TechFlow. I know this might sound crazy, but I think you need to hear what I have to say." Marcus had been one of my best developers before leaving TechFlow 6 months ago to join a competitor. He was a quiet, methodical programmer with an integrity that I had always respected. His sudden departure had surprised me especially since he had given only 2 weeks' notice, instead of his usual thorough preparation for major transitions. "I've been following the news about TechFlow's IPO announcement," he continued, his voice tense with obvious stress. "There are things you need to know, things about why I really left the company. Can we meet somewhere private?" We arranged to meet at a small coffee shop in Mountain View, far from TechFlow's Palo Alto offices. Marcus looked like he hadn't slept well in weeks. His usually neat appearance was disheveled and his hands shook slightly as he ordered his coffee. "I've been carrying this burden for months." He began pulling out his laptop bag. "I couldn't stay at TechFlow anymore because I couldn't be part of what Bradley was doing to you. But I also couldn't just walk away and let it happen." Marcus opened his laptop and pulled up a folder labeled Insurance. Inside were dozens of audio files, video recordings, and document scans that made my heart race. "I started recording conversations with Bradley about 6 months ago when I realized what he was planning. I know it sounds paranoid, but something about the way he talked about the IPO preparation made me uncomfortable. He kept making comments about cleaning up loose ends and finalizing the founder narrative." He clicked on the first audio file. Bradley's voice filled the coffee shop, and I had to lean in to hear his words clearly. "The algorithm is the company's crown jewel," Bradley was saying to someone, probably Sarah based on the voice that responded. "But we can't have any confusion about who created it when we go public. The investment bankers were very clear about that. Investors want a clean founder story, not some messy partnership narrative." "What about Jamie's original documentation?" Sarah's voice asked. "That's why we're restructuring everything now. By the time we file the IPO paperwork, there won't be any documentation that contradicts our founder narrative. Jamie developed that algorithm as an employee, not a partner. That's our story, and that's what the legal documents will reflect." I felt physically ill listening to them casually discuss erasing my contributions, as if they were discussing lunch plans. "There's more," Marcus said, fast-forwarding through the recordings. "This one is from last month, right before the performance review meeting where Bradley gave you that insulting bonus check." The next recording was even more devastating. Bradley was clearly talking to someone on the phone, probably an investor or investment banker. No, you don't understand. There's no co-founder issue to worry about. I developed the core technology myself over the first 2 years of operation. Jaime is a talented employee, but she joined the technical team after the fundamental algorithm was already complete. We've got clean intellectual property rights and a clear founder narrative. This IPO is going to be straightforward." Marcus had dozens of similar recordings. Bradley lying to investors about the company's origins, discussing strategies to handle the Jamie situation, and even bragging about how he had eliminated the co-founder problem that could have complicated their IPO plans. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" I asked. Marcus looked ashamed. "Honestly, I was scared. Bradley had made it very clear that anyone who contradicted the official company narrative would find themselves unemployed and blacklisted in the industry. I have a family to support. But when I heard about your bonus meeting, I realized I couldn't just sit on this information anymore. There's something else, he continued, pulling out a USB drive. I managed to copy some files from Sarah's computer before I left. Financial records, email communications, and document drafts that show exactly how they've been manipulating the corporate structure to erase your ownership. The USB drive contained a treasure trove of evidence. Email chains between Bradley and Sarah discussing how to backdate employee agreements and create documentation supporting the single founder narrative. Financial projections that calculated IPO valuations, while specifically noting that founder equity claims had been resolved through restructuring. Most damning of all were video files from security cameras that Marcus had somehow accessed, showing Bradley and Sarah meeting after hours in the TechFlow offices, shredding documents and replacing files in the corporate records. They've been systematically destroying any evidence that contradicts their version of company history, Marcus explained. But they didn't know I was documenting everything. I called Diana immediately from the coffee shop. When I explained what Marcus had brought me, she asked us to come to her office immediately regardless of the late hour. Diana reviewed Marcus's evidence with the focused intensity of a prosecutor preparing for the most important case of her career. This changes everything, she said after listening to the recordings. We're not just dealing with contract disputes or forgotten paperwork anymore. This is systematic securities fraud, investor deception, and criminal conspiracy. What does that mean for the IPO? I asked. Diana's smile was predatory. It means Bradley is about to commit federal crimes in front of some of the most powerful investors in Silicon Valley, and we're going to have front row seats to watch it happen. Marcus agreed to serve as our key witness, despite the personal risks involved. I've been living with this secret for months, he said. It's time to do the right thing regardless of the consequences. As I drove home that night, I realized that everything had changed. Bradley's betrayal was far worse than I had imagined, but now we had the evidence to expose not just his lies, but his crimes. The man who had stolen my life's work was about to face consequences that would destroy everything he had built on the foundation of my stolen genius. Diana's legal team worked around the clock for the next 2 weeks, building an airtight case that would expose the full scope of Bradley's deception. What they discovered about the IPO preparation was even more shocking than the evidence Marcus had provided. I've seen corporate fraud before, Diana told me during one of our strategy sessions, but nothing quite this elaborate. Bradley isn't just lying about your role in the company. He's created an entirely fictional version of TechFlow's history for potential investors. She spread out copies of the IPO prospectus across her conference table. The document was impressive, professionally designed, and filled with charts, projections, and executive biographies that painted TechFlow as a Silicon Valley success story. But every page was built on lies about my contributions. Look at this, Diana said, pointing to a section titled Founder Vision and Technical Innovation. According to this prospectus, Bradley single-handedly developed all of TechFlow's core technology during an 18-month period of intensive solo research and development. The timeline perfectly matches the period when you were actually doing all the work without salary under your founder's agreement. The biographical section describing Bradley's background was particularly galling. It credited him with breakthrough innovations in data processing algorithms and described him as a visionary technologist who combined advanced computer science theory with practical business applications. Every technical achievement mentioned in that biography was actually my work. The financial projections are based entirely on revenue from licensing your algorithm. Diana continued, flipping through pages of charts and graphs. Without your intellectual property, TechFlow is essentially worthless. But every investor who reads this prospectus will believe they're investing in Bradley's genius. Diana's team had also discovered the extent of investor interest in TechFlow's IPO. Major venture capital firms, pension funds, and investment banks had committed over $200 million based on Bradley's fraudulent presentations. Some of Silicon Valley's most respected investors had written letters of intent based on their belief that Bradley was a technical visionary. We obtained copies of Bradley's investor presentations through some creative legal maneuvering, Diana explained, pulling out a tablet loaded with video files. You need to see how he's been presenting your work to potential investors. The first video showed Bradley standing in front of a room full of suited investors, confidently explaining the revolutionary data processing breakthrough that made TechFlow valuable. He walked through technical diagrams that I had created, explained algorithmic concepts that I had developed, and answered detailed questions about innovations that had come entirely from my research. The beauty of this system, Bradley said in the recording, is that it took me 3 years of intensive development to create something that no one else in the industry has been able to replicate. The technical barriers to entry are so high that we essentially have a permanent competitive advantage. Watching him take credit for my life's work was torture, but Diana insisted I see everything. When we expose this fraud, you need to understand exactly how deep it goes. The second presentation was even worse. Bradley was speaking to a room full of potential board members describing his journey from garage startup to IPO candidate. He told a compelling story about sleepless nights debugging code breakthrough moments in algorithm development and the personal sacrifices he had made to build something revolutionary. Every anecdote he shared was actually from my experience. The night I figured out the recursive optimization that made our algorithm 10 times faster than competing systems. The weekend I spent rewriting our core processing engine to handle real-time data streams. The months I worked without salary, living on savings and determination, while I built the technical foundation that made TechFlow possible. Bradley had stolen not just my work, but my stories, my struggles, and my innovations. He had rewritten history so completely that even I began to doubt my own memories while watching his presentations. The most dangerous part, Diana explained, is that Bradley actually believes his own lies at this point. He's told this fictional version of TechFlow's origins so many times that he's convinced himself it's true. That makes him incredibly persuasive to investors who don't know the real story. Diana's team had calculated the potential damages if Bradley's IPO proceeded successfully. Between my 20% ownership stake and the licensing revenue he had stolen over the past 3 years, I was looking at a potential recovery of over $40 million. But the money wasn't what drove me anymore. It was the principle of not letting someone rewrite history and steal credit for work that had defined my entire career. Here's our strategy, Diana said, pulling out a detailed timeline. Bradley's final IPO presentation to the investment consortium is scheduled for next Friday. He's going to stand in front of 12 of the most powerful financial institutions in California and commit massive securities fraud by lying about the fundamental basis of his company's value. And we're going to let him do it. Diana's smile was sharp as broken glass. We're going to let him dig his own grave. The deeper he commits to these lies in front of investors, the more severe the criminal and civil consequences will be. By the time we expose the truth, Bradley will have committed federal securities fraud in front of witnesses who have committed hundreds of millions of dollars based on his deception. What about the investors? Won't they be hurt when the truth comes out? The investors will be protected because we're going to expose the fraud before any money actually changes hands. But Bradley's reputation and TechFlow's IPO will be completely destroyed. No legitimate investor will touch the company until the ownership questions are resolved and Bradley is removed from leadership. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a sense of anticipation rather than dread. Bradley had built his empire on the foundation of my stolen work, but that empire was about to crumble. And unlike his lies and deception, the collapse would be built on something solid, the truth. The week leading up to Bradley's final IPO presentation felt like the calm before a devastating storm. Diana and her team worked with military precision to ensure that every aspect of our counterattack was perfectly coordinated. We would have exactly one opportunity to expose Bradley's fraud, and the timing had to be flawless. The key, Diana explained during our final strategy session, is to let Bradley fully commit to his fraudulent presentation before we reveal the truth. If we interrupt too early, he can claim misunderstanding or attempt damage control. But if we wait until he's made every major misrepresentation to the investors, the securities fraud charges become inescapable. Diana had arranged for me to attend the presentation under the guise of a potential senior technical hire. Bradley's assistant had confirmed my attendance without questioning why TechFlow's former lead developer would be interested in rejoining the company. The irony of the situation was almost amusing if it weren't for the millions of dollars at stake. Marcus will be positioned outside the building with backup evidence, Diana continued, and I'll be attending as legal counsel for one of the investment firms. Nobody will suspect anything until the moment we spring the trap. Over the past few days, Diana's investigation had uncovered even more evidence of Bradley's systematic fraud. We now had documentation showing that he had stolen intellectual property from 3 other former employees, not just me. Each theft followed a similar pattern, promising equity or ownership stakes to talented developers, then restructuring corporate documents to erase their contributions once their work was complete. Bradley has been running this scam for years, Diana said, showing me emails between Bradley and Sarah discussing how to handle potential founder claims from other former employees. You're not his first victim, just his most valuable one. The evidence against Sarah was equally damning. As chief financial officer, she had actively participated in creating fraudulent financial records, backdating employment contracts, and hiding licensing revenue that should have been shared with legitimate co-founders. Her role in the conspiracy was so extensive that Diana expected federal prosecutors would file charges against her as well. The beautiful things about this case, Diana explained, is that Bradley and Sarah have documented their own crimes. Every email, every forged document, every fraudulent filing creates additional evidence of their conspiracy to commit securities fraud. Diana had also coordinated with Marcus and 2 other former employees who had evidence of Bradley's intellectual property theft. All 3 men had agreed to serve as witnesses despite potential professional risks. Their combined testimony would paint a picture of systematic fraud that went far beyond my individual case. When we expose this conspiracy, Diana said, it's going to destroy Bradley's credibility so completely that no investor will ever trust him again. And since TechFlow's entire value proposition is based on stolen intellectual property, the company itself will likely collapse without new investment. The personal impact on Bradley would be even more severe. Diana had consulted with federal prosecutors who confirmed that the evidence we had gathered would support criminal charges for securities fraud conspiracy and potentially racketeering under federal organized crime statutes. Bradley was looking at potential prison time, not just financial penalties. Are you prepared for how intense this is going to be? Diana asked me the night before the presentation. Once we expose this fraud publicly, Bradley is going to fight back with everything he has. He's going to try to destroy your reputation, question your motives, and probably attempt to countersue for defamation or interference with business relations. I thought about the past 5 years of my life, the countless hours I had spent building TechFlow's technical foundation, the personal relationships I had sacrificed to focus on my work, the dreams I had invested in a partnership that I now realized had been a lie from the beginning. I've already lost everything that mattered to me, I told Diana. My work, my recognition, my partnership, and my financial future. Bradley stole all of that when he decided to rewrite history. At this point, I have nothing left to lose and everything to gain by exposing the truth. Diana nodded approvingly. That's the attitude we need. Bradley has spent years building his empire on the foundation of other people's work. Tomorrow we tear that empire down and rebuild it on something more solid. Justice. The final preparation involved coordinating our timing with Diana's legal team. She would enter the presentation exactly 30 minutes after Bradley began giving him enough time to make his key fraudulent claims, but interrupting before investors could ask detailed technical questions that might expose inconsistencies in his story. Remember, Diana told me as we reviewed our plan one final time, your role tomorrow is to observe and document. I'll handle all the legal confrontation. Your job is to stay calm, take notes, and be prepared to answer technical questions about your algorithm if the investors want to hear from the actual creator. As I drove home that night, I felt a strange sense of peace for the first time in weeks. Tomorrow, the truth would finally come to light. Bradley's elaborate deception would be exposed in front of the most powerful investors in Silicon Valley. And my stolen life's work would finally be recognized for what it really was, the foundation of a multi-million-dollar company that I had helped create. The man who had laughed at my $300,000 bonus request was about to learn that some thefts have consequences that extend far beyond money. He had stolen my identity as a founder, but tomorrow I was going to reclaim it in the most public and devastating way possible. The morning of Bradley's IPO presentation dawned clear and bright, typical California weather that seemed to mock the storm brewing inside TechFlow's corporate headquarters. I arrived at the building 30 minutes early, my stomach churning with a mixture of anticipation and nervous energy that I hadn't felt since my college finals. The TechFlow building looked exactly as I remembered it, all glass and steel, designed to project innovative success. Walking through the lobby where I had once belonged felt surreal, like visiting a place from a former life. The receptionist recognized me, but seemed confused about why I was there. "Shamie, are you coming back to the team?" she asked with genuine warmth. "Something like that," I replied, signing the visitor log with a name that felt foreign in this context. The presentation was being held in TechFlow's largest conference room, a space I had helped design during our expansion 2 years ago. 12 investors were already seated around the polished mahogany table, representing some of the most prestigious venture capital firms and investment banks in California. The collective wealth and influence in that room could have funded dozens of startups or destroyed careers with a single decision. Bradley stood at the front of the room, looking every inch the successful tech entrepreneur in his tailored navy suit and confident smile. Sarah sat at his right hand, her laptop open to financial projections that I knew were built on fraudulent foundations. Neither of them noticed me taking a seat at the back of the room, just another face among the various analysts and assistants who attended such presentations. "Gentlemen and ladies," Bradley began, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of someone who had given this presentation dozens of times. "Thank you for joining us today for what I believe will be the most exciting IPO opportunity you'll see this year." His opening slides were professionally designed and compelling, filled with market analysis and growth projections that painted TechFlow as the next great Silicon Valley success story. Bradley moved through the preliminary material with practiced ease, discussing market opportunities and competitive advantages with the fluency of someone who had memorized every talking point. "The foundation of TechFlow's revolutionary success," Bradley continued, clicking to a slide titled "Technical Innovation," "is our proprietary data processing algorithm that I developed during 18 months of intensive research and development." I felt my hands clench involuntarily as he began describing my algorithm as his own creation. Every technical detail he mentioned, every innovation he claimed credit for, every breakthrough he described as his personal achievement was actually the result of my work, my sleepless nights, my creative problem solving. "The beauty of this system," Bradley said, his voice gaining enthusiasm as he warmed to his favorite topic, "is the recursive optimization framework that allows real-time processing of massive data streams. It took me 3 years of trial and error to develop something that our competitors still can't replicate." One of the investors, a sharp-eyed woman from Goldman Sachs, raised her hand. "Can you walk us through the specific technical challenges you overcame in developing this algorithm?" Bradley's answer was flawless, because he was describing my actual experience overcoming those exact challenges. He told the story of the breakthrough moment when I figured out how to reduce processing time by 70% through a novel caching strategy. He described the weekend I spent rewriting the core engine to handle real-time data streams. He even mentioned the specific debugging techniques I had developed to identify performance bottlenecks. Every word was technically accurate because he was describing my genuine innovations. But every word was also a lie because he was claiming credit for work he had never done. "The intellectual property protections are ironclad," Bradley continued, clicking to a slide about patents and trade secrets. "As the sole technical founder and inventor of Record TechFlow owns all rights to these innovations with no potential complications or competing claims." That statement was so blatantly false that I had to bite my tongue to keep from interrupting. Diana had been very clear about the timing of our intervention. Bradley spent the next 20 minutes walking through financial projections, all of which were based on licensing revenue from my stolen algorithm. He described TechFlow's competitive moat market positioning and growth strategy with the confidence of someone who genuinely believed his own lies. "Our revenue model is particularly strong," Bradley explained, "because the technical barriers to entry are so high that we essentially have a permanent competitive advantage. The algorithm that powers our entire business took years of specialized development that would be nearly impossible for competitors to replicate." At exactly 30 minutes into the presentation, Diana Walsh walked through the conference room door. She was dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit and carried herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to dominating corporate boardrooms. Several investors recognized her immediately, and I could see them exchanging glances about why Silicon Valley's most feared litigation attorney was attending their IPO presentation. "Mr. Thornton," Diana said, her voice cutting through Bradley's sales pitch like a blade. "I apologize for interrupting, but I represent a party with material information relevant to your presentation. May I have permission to address the investors regarding a significant misrepresentation in your IPO prospectus?" The room fell completely silent. Bradley's face went white, then red, as he clearly recognized Diana, despite never having met her. Sarah's laptop screen reflected the panic in her eyes as she quickly closed her financial projections. "I'm sorry, but this is a private investor presentation," Bradley managed to say, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. "If you have concerns about our filing documents, you can address them through proper channels." Diana smiled with predatory satisfaction. "Actually, Mr. Thornton's securities fraud is a matter of immediate public interest. I believe these investors deserve to know the truth about TechFlow's actual ownership structure and the real creator of your so-called proprietary algorithm." She pulled out a manila folder and began distributing copies of documents to each investor. "What you have in front of you is a founder's agreement signed 5 years ago between Mr. Thornton and Ms. Jamie Rodriguez, granting Ms. Rodriguez 20% equity ownership in TechFlow Industries in exchange for developing the proprietary algorithm that Mr. Thornton has just claimed to have created himself." The investors began studying the documents with the focused intensity of people who suddenly realized they might have been about to make a very expensive mistake. The Goldman Sachs representative was the first to speak. "Mr. Thornton, can you explain why your IPO prospectus makes no mention of a co-founder or any competing ownership claims?" Bradley's composure completely cracked. "That agreement is outdated. Ms. Rodriguez was an employee, not a founder. The corporate structure has been properly reorganized to reflect the actual ownership of the company." Diana's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Reorganized by systematically forging documents, backdating employee agreements, and destroying evidence of Ms. Rodriguez's contributions." She played one of Marcus's audio recordings through her phone's speaker. Bradley's voice filled the room, clearly discussing strategies to eliminate the co-founder problem and create documentation to support the single-founder narrative. The transformation in the room was immediate and devastating. Investors who had been listening to Bradley's presentation with interested enthusiasm now stared at him with suspicion and disgust. The woman from Goldman Sachs was already packing up her materials. "Furthermore," Diana continued, "TechFlow's financial records show licensing revenue of over $15 million generated from Ms. Rodriguez's algorithm money that was legally owed to her as a 20% owner, but was instead hidden through fraudulent accounting practices." Sarah tried to defend herself. "Those financial records are confidential and proprietary. You have no right to—" Diana cut her off with a wave of her hand. "Ms. Chen, your emails discussing how to backdate employee agreements and clean up founding documents constitute evidence of criminal conspiracy to commit securities fraud. I'd recommend consulting with an attorney before making any further statements." The room erupted in chaos as investors began demanding explanations, gathering their materials, and making phone calls to their legal departments. Bradley stood frozen at the front of the room, his carefully crafted presentation destroyed in a matter of minutes. "The IPO prospectus you've been considering," Diana announced to the room, "represents systematic fraud designed to steal millions of dollars from the actual creator of TechFlow's core technology. Every technical innovation, every competitive advantage, and every revenue projection is based on intellectual property that Mr. Thornton stole from Ms. Rodriguez through document forgery and corporate conspiracy." One by one, the investors began leaving the room. Some expressed outrage at having their time wasted. Others threatened legal action for securities fraud. The representative from Goldman Sachs stopped at the door to address Bradley directly. "Mr. Thornton, Goldman Sachs will be withdrawing our investment commitment immediately. You should expect to hear from our legal department regarding potential criminal referrals to federal prosecutors." Within 15 minutes, the conference room was empty except for Bradley, Sarah, Diana, and me. Bradley slumped in his chair like a deflated balloon, his empire crumbling around him in real time. "Bradley," I said, speaking directly to him for the first time since that humiliating bonus meeting, "you asked me not to get ahead of myself about owning this company. Turns out I wasn't getting ahead of anything. I was just remembering what you tried to make me forget." The man who had laughed at my $300,000 bonus request now faced the complete destruction of his career, his company, and quite possibly his freedom. Justice, it turned out, had a sense of irony that even I couldn't have predicted. 3 months later, I stood in my new office at the restructured TechFlow Industries, looking out at the same Silicon Valley skyline that had witnessed Bradley's spectacular downfall. The company had been completely transformed both legally and culturally into something I could finally be proud to call home. The aftermath of Diana's boardroom devastation had moved with the swift efficiency that only comes when justice aligns with irrefutable evidence. Within 48 hours of the exposed IPO fraud, federal prosecutors had filed criminal charges against both Bradley and Sarah for securities fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. The FBI had raided TechFlow's offices to secure evidence, and both conspirators found themselves facing potential prison sentences that could span decades. Bradley's plea negotiations had lasted less than a week. Faced with overwhelming evidence of his systematic fraud audio recordings of his admissions and testimony from multiple witnesses, his attorneys advised him to accept a plea agreement rather than risk a lengthy trial. He ultimately pleaded guilty to multiple federal felonies and agreed to forfeit all his ownership stakes in TechFlow as part of his restitution. Sarah's legal situation proved even more precarious. As chief financial officer, her active participation in creating fraudulent documents and hiding revenue made her prosecution straightforward. She received a sentence of 7 years in federal prison and complete financial forfeiture of any assets derived from the conspiracy. The legal resolution of my ownership claims moved surprisingly quickly once the criminal fraud was exposed. Federal courts moved to freeze TechFlow's assets pending resolution of ownership disputes, but Diana's evidence made my 20% equity claim essentially undisputable. The original founders' agreement, combined with Marcus's recordings and the forged documents Bradley had created, painted such a clear picture of systematic theft that no reasonable legal challenge was possible. But the most satisfying transformation wasn't legal or financial. It was cultural. Marcus returned to TechFlow as our new chief technology officer, bringing with him the 2 other developers who had been willing to testify against Bradley's fraud. Together, we rebuilt the company's technical leadership with people who valued integrity and collaboration over individual glory and stolen credit. "You know what I missed most about working here?" Marcus told me during his first week back. "It was the feeling that we were building something meaningful together, not just enriching someone who took credit for our work." The new TechFlow operated on principles of transparency and shared success that Bradley's regime had never understood. We implemented profit-sharing programs that ensured every employee benefited from the company's growth. We established clear intellectual property agreements that protected both individual contributions and collaborative innovations. Most importantly, we created a culture where recognition and credit were shared honestly, rather than hoarded by executives. 6 months after Bradley's arrest, we successfully completed an honest IPO that raised $150 million for company expansion. This time, the prospectus accurately credited my algorithm as the foundation of our technical advantages, listed me as co-founder and chief innovation officer, and presented investors with transparent financial records that had been audited by independent firms. The IPO celebration was everything that Bradley's fraudulent version would never have been. Instead of stolen glory and hidden ownership, we had genuine partnership and shared success. My 20% equity stake in the public company made me wealthy beyond anything I had imagined when I first started coding in Bradley's garage, but the financial rewards were secondary to the deeper satisfaction of reclaiming my professional identity. The best part, Santa, Diana told me at the IPO celebration party, is that this case is going to serve as a warning to other executives who think they can steal their employees' work. Bradley's prosecution received national attention in the business press. Every entrepreneur in Silicon Valley now knows that intellectual property theft has serious consequences. The personal transformation in my own life had been equally dramatic. The stress and betrayal of Bradley's deception had nearly destroyed my confidence and my passion for innovation. But fighting back and winning had restored something deeper than financial security. I had rediscovered my own voice and my own worth as a creator and leader. I used part of my IPO windfall to establish the Rodriguez Foundation for Intellectual Property Protection, a nonprofit organization that provides legal assistance to inventors and developers who face theft of their work. Diana joined the foundation's board of directors, and we've already helped dozens of creators protect their innovations from fraudulent business partners. The thing about betrayal, I told a group of young female entrepreneurs during a foundation-sponsored workshop, is that it can either destroy your faith in business partnerships or teach you to build better ones. The key is making sure that trust is backed up by proper documentation and legal protection. Marcus often joined me for these educational sessions, sharing his perspective as someone who had witnessed corporate fraud but found the courage to expose it. The hardest part wasn't deciding to speak up, he would tell audiences. The hardest part was living with myself while staying silent. Sometimes doing the right thing requires taking personal risks, but the cost of doing nothing is always higher. The Foundation's work had expanded beyond individual cases to advocate for stronger intellectual property protections and whistleblower protections for employees who expose corporate fraud. We lobbied for legislation that would make it easier for creators to prove ownership of their innovations and harder for executives to hide systematic theft. Today, as I sat in my office reviewing applications from inventors seeking foundation assistance, I reflected on how completely my life had transformed. A year ago, I was a frustrated employee whose contributions had been erased by a fraudulent boss. Today, I was a successful entrepreneur, respected innovator, and advocate for justice, whose story had inspired legislative changes to protect other creators. The $300 coffee party check that Bradley had given me still sat framed on my office wall, not as a reminder of humiliation, but as evidence of how far justice can reach when truth is backed by determination and excellent legal representation. That insulting piece of paper had ultimately cost Bradley his freedom, his fortune, and his reputation, while returning to me everything he had stolen and more. But perhaps the most meaningful transformation was in my relationship with my own work. Bradley's theft had made me question whether my innovations were truly valuable or if I had overestimated my contributions. Reclaiming credit for my algorithm and seeing it drive a successful public company had restored my confidence in my own abilities and my right to recognition for my creations. The young entrepreneurs who attended foundation workshops often asked me about forgiveness and whether I harbored resentment toward Bradley for his betrayal. The answer surprised many of them. I don't think about Bradley anymore, I would tell them. Forgiveness isn't about excusing what someone did to you. It's about refusing to let their actions define your future. Bradley spent years stealing my work, but I've spent the time since then building something better than anything he ever imagined. The final irony of the whole situation was that TechFlow had become far more successful under honest leadership than it ever would have been under Bradley's fraudulent regime. Our transparent business practices and collaborative culture attracted the best talent in Silicon Valley. Our commitment to shared success created employee loyalty that translated into better products and stronger customer relationships. As I finished reviewing the day's foundation applications and prepared to head home, I thought about the question I wanted to ask viewers of this story. Have you ever had someone take credit for your work or try to minimize your contributions to a shared success? The experience of having your efforts stolen or diminished is unfortunately common in business, but it doesn't have to be permanent. Sometimes fighting back requires courage, patience, and excellent legal help, but justice is possible when truth is on your side. If this story resonated with your own experiences or inspired you to think differently about protecting your professional contributions, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Please take a moment to like this video if it provided value. Subscribe for more stories about overcoming workplace injustice, and share it with anyone who might benefit from knowing that stolen recognition can be reclaimed and fraudulent bosses can face real consequences. Thank you for joining me on this journey from betrayal to triumph. Remember that your work has value, your contributions deserve recognition, and no one has the right to steal credit for your innovations. Sometimes the best revenge against those who try to diminish you is simply refusing to stay diminished. Until next time, keep creating, keep fighting for what's yours, and never let anyone convince you that your contributions are worth less than they truly are.